Disclaimer, this episode will contain mentions of sexual assault as well as harassment, just like the previous 2 episodes. Welcome back to Greek Talk, the podcast where we talk about all things Greek mythology. In the last 2 episodes, we talked about both Perseus and Medusa's side of their myth. This episode, we will focus on the book Stoneblind. I read Stoneblind in preparation for this podcast, and I wanted to dedicate a whole episode to it. I'm going to start off this episode with a very, very brief recap of the story. I'll try not to spoil the book too much, but just spoiler warning if you do decide to read it. There may be spoilers. I can't guarantee that there won't be. So this is the book starts out just like the original myth. Medusa is born to sea gods and given to her sisters, the 2 Gorgons. When Medusa is 16, she is assaulted by Poseidon in Athena's temple while she is visiting it right after it is made by the village she lives next to. After this, Medusa hides in her cave for a few days, kind of tortured by, mentally scarred and tortured by the assault. Kind of out of nowhere, Athena one day gets upset at Poseidon and decides to take it out on Medusa and curse her. Medusa wakes up in a lot of pain in the middle of the night one night with snakes where her hair used to be, and she is now able to turn things into stone. Medusa keeps her eyes covered with a piece of fabric for the next 2-ish months before she is killed. Her eyes are pretty much completely covered for the entirety of the book. So we don't get much of her turning things to stone. We really only know of 2 or 3 creatures. When she is beheaded by Perseus, her head is used to kill over 100 people, and for some reason, the author decided to make her head a completely different person from Medusa. So her head and Medusa have 2 different names. I will not be referring to Medusa's head as the different name because I'm worried that will get confusing, so I will just refer to it as Medusa's head. I'm gonna start, before I even talk about the differences, before I talk about really anything, I'm just gonna come right out and say I did not like this book. This book was not a pleasant experience for me. It was not fun for me to read. I thought that the beginning of it was good, but I did not enjoy I did not enjoy most of the book. And I want to give just a disclaimer really fast that I understand that a retelling, which is what Stoneblind is, will not be exactly the same. I understand that it is a retelling, so that there will be differences, and I understand that, and I get that. But there were too many differences in this book for me to just ignore them. And reading this and reading all of the differences and all of the it just upset me to read, and I felt like I needed to dedicate an entire episode to why I believe this book is not a very good retelling of Medusa's story. First and foremost, the biggest problem I have with this book is it is supposed to be a retelling of Medusa's story. specifically Medusa's side of the story, and it is supposed to be a feminist retelling. Except, Medusa is barely in the book, having a total of 6 chapters, all of which are no longer than 4 or 5 pages. Perseus, who does not have any chapters named after him, somehow has more chapters about him than Medusa does. All of the chapters are supposed to be narrated by women and follow the female perspectives of the story, but there are some chapters that are labeled as one woman's chapter, but throughout the chapter Perseus is narrating, which confused me and did not make much sense to me. Another big problem I had was Perseus is portrayed as bratty and selfish, despite him not at all being this way in the original myth. In the original myth, he is a kid who is trying to protect and save his mom, and he's never portrayed as bratty or selfish. He's always portrayed as a hero and as someone who genuinely wants to protect the people he loves. Medusa never becomes a follower of Athena in this book, which is a very, very big part of the original myth. In the original myth, that is the reason she is assaulted, which it is really a big part of the original myth, and it helps build Medusa's character, it helps build Athena's character, and it helps drive the story, but in Stoneblind, she is assaulted at the age of 16 before she even really learns anything about Athena, despite in the original myth being a follower of Athena and being in her 20s or 30s when she is assaulted. The last big gripe I have with the story is it is supposed to be portrayed as a feminist retelling, but the author writes this as that all of the women in the book are the good guys. She tries to portray all of the women as heroes of some sort, which even in the book itself, the author does not do a good job of making us feel bad for these characters. There are a couple instances where the author definitely tries to get us to feel, the reader to feel bad for a certain character, specifically Athena, who in the book is really, really awful, and it just does not work because the author wrote the characters as awful. In the original myth, the gods and even some of the humans are just horrible to Medusa and really just in general to all of humanity, and I found it very just off-putting, and something I wrote down because I wanted to remember it was feminist does not mean that all women are good people. Feminism, being a feminist does not mean that you think that all women are good people. And I wanted to point that out. Those were all of my my bigger issues with the story itself. But I do have some, there are some smaller things that I just found personally either frustrating or I thought that didn't need to be changed. So one of them was in the book. Athena, her name is changed to Athene for seemingly no reason. It is widely accepted that Athena is spelled and pronounced Athena, but and not many people write it or spell it or say it as Athene. There are some, and I'm not trying to judge those people, but I think that if you're going to write a book about Greek mythology, you should go for the more general and common spelling and pronunciation of the name, because I believe Athena is historically accurate. Another thing that just personally bothered me was Medusa and her head, after it's cut off, are two different people. They have two different personalities. They kind of act two different ages, and it just threw me off a little. And I thought that if they had just kept Medusa's head as Medusa, they could have had so many more chapters from her perspective, and they could have just included her so much more in the book and made it so much more about Medusa. Another thing that's a little bit bigger than those are the author starts to pull from Roman mythology to tell the story instead of from Greek mythology. The biggest example I found of this was Athena. When at one point in the book, it is mentioned that Athena has sort of a love interest kind of person, and I believe that she has a child, which in Greek mythology, she has no partners of any sort, and she has no children of any sort. So I found that personally just strange and an unnecessary change, because it did not add really anything to the story. And my last small difference is that in Stoneblind, the Gorgons, Medusa's sisters, fight back against Poseidon, and almost they curse his name, and somehow this does not get them punished, or I know they're immortals, so they can't really be killed, but this does not cause them to be punished by the gods, which is a very, very typical reaction from the gods to being disrespected. I just found that personally very strange. So, along with there being just differences in the story that I did not enjoy, there were also just general things about the book that I just did not like. For one, the book's portrayal of feminism is that all men are bad, and all men are evil and bratty and selfish, which is not what feminism is, and it bothered me that was how this book was portraying it. And I wrote another thing down that I wanted to remember that was just something I thought of while I was reading, and it was putting men down is not feminism. It is just rude and unnecessary, because that's what the book is doing. It is making all men seem bad, which is not the case at all, and I don't like that portrayal. The humor also in this book is not good. The writing style is very formal, and I think tries to sort of follow the complexity of the actual Greek myths, but the humor is very childish and very modern humor, and it does not fit with the book or the writing style and feels so out of place. It's funny, but it's so out of left field. I know this episode is going very long, so I apologize, but another thing is the author writes whole chapters about just telling you what you need to think. Or there was one that literally insulted the reader. One of the ones that tells you how to think says, quote, "Perhaps you are stubborn or desperate." Sorry, that is the one that insults you. That is talking to the reader about, I believe, your like opinion on Perseus at this point in the book, and that was not appreciated. And then another part of the book, which I believe is, yes, this is the one that's just telling you what you need to be thinking, is anyway, don't even begin to feel sorry for that brat. Talking about Perseus. And this is a whole, I believe, 2 or 3 page chapter just talking about why we should not like Perseus as a character. And I found those chapters personally just insulting. They seemed insulting. This is kind of just a quick one, but all of the chapters were very boring, or a lot of the long ones were very boring, and they could have been summed up in like 2 or 3 pages. There were some parts of the book that were strangely graphic, to the point where I would give an example, but it makes me uncomfortable. It made me uncomfortable to read it, let alone repeat what I read. So I will not be repeating any of that. But it was unnecessary. Because this episode is running really, really long, and I do not want to go over 20 minutes, I had a whole other section planned out where I would tell you about this other book that I would recommend, but instead I will just be recommending it. So there's another book called, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Percy Jackson series, but Rick Riordan, the author, wrote 2 books, kind of outside of that series, that are narrated by the main character, Percy Jackson, the Percy Jackson series, Percy Jackson. One of them is Greek Gods, and the other one is Greek Heroes. I believe those are the titles. Both are amazing, but I believe it is Greek Heroes that has a retelling of the Medusa and Perseus myth, and it is an amazing retelling. It is the first retelling of this story that I read. In fact, I read it before I read the original myth, and it stays very true to the myth, and it's funny in an appropriate way. It's for kids, so it's not graphic, it's not inappropriate, and it is done so well and written so well, and it's a very good retelling of the Medusa story. So I definitely recommend that retelling instead of Stoneblind. Thank you all for listening to this 3-episode series. I hope you enjoyed them. Just to kind of wrap up here, I would recommend not reading Stoneblind and instead reading Percy Jackson. I hope you enjoyed me talking about Greek mythology, and thank you for listening.